Colonel Tate did not raise his voice. That was the thing people who hadn't worked under him never understood. He didn't need to. He had a way of making quiet sound like a verdict. "She's a medic," he said. He set his coffee cup down on the folding table outside the TOC with the deliberate care of a man who wanted to make sure everyone around him understood that the conversation was already over. "I don't care what her quals say on paper. She is not going on that observation post." The men around him didn't laugh. They were too professional for that. But something moved through the group, a shift in posture, a small collective exhale, the particular body language of people who have decided without investigation that a decision has already been made and are simply waiting for the formality of it to be spoken aloud. Sergeant First Class Nix heard all of it from 15 feet away. She had not been included in the conversation. Nobody had thought to include her. She picked up her clipboard and went back to work. Before we go any further, if this kind of story is something you want to hear more of, subscribe to this channel and drop a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from. These stories travel further than most people expect. The firebase had been in operation for 11 weeks. It sat in a shallow bowl of high desert in eastern Afghanistan, ringed by ridgelines that the intelligence reports described as monitored, and the people who actually worked the perimeter described, in less polished language, as a problem they hadn't solved yet. The firebase supported a small combined task force, a mix of Army and Special Operations elements running reconnaissance and advise and assist missions out of 3 forward operating bases to the north. Supply was unreliable. Communication windows were narrow. The nearest surgical facility was a 40-minute flight in conditions that were rarely cooperative. That was why they had Nix. She had been assigned to the firebase 8 months earlier as the senior medical non-commissioned officer, which in practical terms meant she ran everything medical on the installation and a significant portion of what happened at the FOBs. She was 31 years old. She had been in the Army for 9 years, had completed 2 previous deployments, and held a Special Operations Combat Medic certification that fewer than 400 people in the entire armed forces could claim. She had managed trauma cases in the field that would have been challenging in a hospital setting. She had done it with equipment that fit in a rucksack. She had done it in the dark, in cold, that made instruments slippery and hands unreliable, with people shooting at her from directions she could not always identify. None of this was in the briefing Colonel Tate had received, or if it was, it had not registered as relevant to the question he had just decided. The question was this: the observation post on the northern ridgeline had been flagged by imagery analysts as a likely insurgent staging point for a series of indirect fire attacks that had been creeping progressively closer to the firebase over the past 3 weeks. The task force had a standing protocol for establishing counter-observation posts in response to exactly this kind of pattern, and the protocol called for a 2-person element with specific skills, 1 shooter rated for extreme long-range marksmanship, and 1 combat medic capable of operating independently in an austere environment. The shooter was easy. They had Staff Sergeant Prenn, who held a confirmed long-range marksmanship record from a training exercise in Nevada and had experience on counter-sniper operations from his previous deployment. The medic slot was the problem. 3 people on the firebase held the necessary qualifications. 2 of them were recovering from an illness that had moved through the unit 2 weeks earlier and were not yet cleared for strenuous field operations. The 3rd was Nix. Tate's response to this logistical fact had been the coffee cup and the quiet voice. "She is a medic. She is not going on that observation post." Nix did not go to Tate directly. She had been in the Army long enough to understand that going to Tate directly would accomplish nothing except making Tate feel that his authority had been challenged, which would make him more fixed in his position than he already was. She understood bureaucratic resistance the way she understood trauma, not as something to fight head-on, but as something to route around when possible. She went to Captain Surge, the task force operations officer, who was 28 years old, had been in his current role for 4 months, and had the specific quality of a person who understood that his job was to solve problems rather than protect the shape of the solution he'd already imagined. "Tell me about the quals requirement," she said. She did not ask if she could sit down. She pulled the chair out across from his desk and sat, because she had learned that performing uncertainty you didn't feel was a form of dishonesty she couldn't afford. Surge looked at her over a map, spread across most of his work surface. He was quiet for a moment, which was not unusual for him. He was a deliberate thinker, slower than he looked, which people sometimes mistook for hesitation. The slot requires a 68W with SOCM certification, he said, and field-qualified marksmanship at extended range, combat effective beyond 500 meters. I hold CM, Nix said. What's the marksmanship threshold? Serge glanced down. Effective engagement rating at 800 meters minimum. Documented. My qualification record from the range at Bragg 2 years ago puts me at confirmed hits through 1100 meters. It's in my file. She paused. If someone pulled my file. Serge was quiet again. Then, the colonel reviewed the available personnel. The colonel reviewed the available personnel he was aware of, Nix said. Not sharply. Just precisely. Those are different things. Serge looked at her for a long moment. Something in his expression changed. Not dramatically. He was too contained for that, but it changed. I'll need to see the range documentation, he said. She had it in her hand. She had printed it before she came. Tate did not take it well. That was not a surprise. What surprised the people in the two who were close enough to overhear the conversation was that he took it in exactly the way a man takes news he cannot actually dispute, but very much wishes he could. He went through the documentation twice. He asked Serge 2 questions, both of which Serge answered with careful precision. He did not raise his voice because he never raised his voice, but the coffee cup did not get picked up again for several minutes. She goes as the medical element, Tate said finally. She is not the primary shooter on that post. Prenn makes every shot decision. She treats casualties if there are casualties, and otherwise she stays behind cover. Is that understood? Serge said. Yes, sir. Nix, who had not been in the room but who had been told by Serge immediately afterward, said nothing when she heard it. She had expected something like this. Tate was not a man who reversed himself completely. He was a man who adjusted the shape of his original position until it was technically different from what he'd first said, but still pointed in the same direction. She could work with technically different. They left for the observation post at 0300, which was when the thermal signature of the ridgeline was coldest, and the contrast between a moving human body and the surrounding terrain was at its worst for anyone watching from below. Prenn was in front. He moved with the deliberate efficiency of someone who had done this enough times that the route planning had become almost automatic. Pace count, terrain features, fallback positions memorized before they left the wire. Nix moved behind him and slightly to the right, carrying her medical pack and her rifle. The rifle was her own, not the M4 assigned to her by the unit, but a bolt-action platform she had been building and refining for 6 years, a .300 Winchester Magnum, with a custom stock adjusted to her frame and a scope she had spent more time with than she had with most people in her life. She had carried it through 2 deployments without ever being asked about it, because nobody had ever had reason to ask. It lived in a case that looked like a hard-sided equipment bag. In all the time she had been on this firebase, no one had looked inside it. The hike to the observation post took 2 hours and 40 minutes. They reached the position as the sky was beginning to lighten in the east. Not bright yet, just the first gray suggestion of dawn shifting over the ridgeline. Nix got her pack off and set up her medical kit in the sheltered position behind a rock shelf that gave them cover from the valley below. Prenn took his position at the forward edge of the post, where the line of sight opened across the slope toward the insurgent staging area identified in the imagery. They waited. That was most of what observation posts were. Waiting. The waiting had a quality to it that Nix had taken a long time to make peace with, a specific patience that was not passive but active, a state of sustained readiness that looked like stillness from the outside and felt like controlled tension from the inside. She had learned it the same way she'd learned everything she knew about this work, by practicing it until the discomfort of it became ordinary. At 0847, Prenn said quietly, "I've got movement." She was already looking. 3 figures, moving along a shallow ridgeline 200 meters below and 400 meters to the northeast, carrying equipment. The imagery had been right about the staging point, wrong about where exactly it was being used from. Prenn went through his calculations. Wind, range, elevation. He worked carefully and without rushing, which was the right call. At his distance and in the morning wind coming up the valley, this was a shot that required everything to be right. He missed, not badly. The round impacted less than 2 feet from the leading figure. But 2 feet at that distance was a miss, and the figure scattered immediately, taking cover behind the ridgeline and making any follow-up shot impossible in the next 30 seconds. Prenn said a word under his breath. He cycled the bolt. Wind shifted, Nix said. Not a criticism. A fact. She had been watching the movement of the scrub grass in the saddle between them and the target. Between Prenn's last wind reading and the shot. It was the kind of thing that happened. Coming from the northwest now, gusting. Prenn nodded. He was already reacquiring. What happened next was one of those things that occurs in the field without announcement or preparation. The movement of time changes, and afterward people struggle to explain exactly what it was that made them react before they consciously decided to react. The fourth figure appeared from behind the ridgeline to Nix's left, not the objective ridgeline, the one behind them, at a range of approximately 320 meters, moving fast, armed, heading toward a position that would give direct line of sight to Prenn. Prenn had not seen it. He was focused forward and to the northeast. His field of view through the scope did not include the left flank. Nix had her rifle up before she had finished processing what she was seeing. The wind was the same wind she'd already read. The range she calculated in the same way she calculated drug doses and IV flow rates. Quickly, from numbers she already knew, with adjustments made in real time as conditions changed. She settled her breathing. She did not rush the shot, because rushing a shot at 320 meters in wind was how you missed, and missing was not an option she was working with. She squeezed the trigger. The figure dropped. Prenn turned at the sound. He saw what she was looking at. He saw what she had done. He looked at her for one long moment, the kind of look a person gives when they need to recalibrate something they thought they had already figured out. Then he turned back to his scope, because there were still 3 figures somewhere below them on that ridgeline. The debrief happened 4 hours after they were extracted. Tate was there. Serge was there. A CD investigator named Roach had been brought in from Bagram because a report had been filed. By whom? Nobody said directly, though the shape of who had access to the initial communications made the answer fairly clear. The investigation was procedural. A non-rated marksman, which is what Nix technically was in her designated role, had discharged a weapon in a combat situation outside the parameters of her assigned position. That was the official framing. It needed to be reviewed. Nix sat in the debrief with her hands flat on the table and answered every question she was asked directly and completely. She did not hedge. She described the situation, her assessment, her decision, and her shot. When Roach asked whether she had deviated from her assigned role, she said yes. When he asked why, she said because Staff Sergeant Prenn would have been killed if she had not, and he was not positioned to see the threat, and there was no time to alert him and reposition. When Roach asked how she could be certain of that, she said she couldn't be certain of anything, except that she had made a calculation, and the calculation had been right. She said it with exactly the same flatness she used to explain a medication dosage. Not defiance, just precision. Prenn was asked to give a statement. He sat across from Roach and described what he had seen when he turned around. He described the range. He described the wind conditions. He described what the outcome would have been if the shot had not been taken. When Roach asked him to characterize the marksmanship, Prenn was quiet for a moment, the way he was quiet when he was working through a problem that deserved more than a quick answer. That shot, he said, in those conditions, at that range, with a target moving at that speed, is in the top 3 shots I have ever seen made in an operational environment, and I have seen a lot of shots. Roach wrote it down. He didn't look up. Tate said nothing during Prenn's statement. He sat with his arms crossed and his jaw set in the specific way of a man who has arrived somewhere he did not intend to go and is determining the best route back to where he started. Nix was confined to administrative duties pending review. That was standard. She understood it was standard. She ran her clinic, processed her supply requests, completed her reports. She did not talk about the investigation with the people who worked for her, because the investigation was not their concern, and she had never been someone who managed uncertainty by distributing it to people who couldn't do anything about it. On the 3rd day, she had a visitor, Command Sergeant Major Dex, the senior NCO for the entire task force, based out of the main fob to the north. A man she had met exactly twice before, appeared at her clinic at 0700 with 2 cups of coffee and sat down without being invited. He was 61. He had the kind of face that does not age so much as consolidate, the specific density of features that accumulates in people who have been doing hard things for a very long time and have stopped being surprised by any of them. He had been in the Army for 37 years. He had the quiet authority of someone for whom rank had long since become irrelevant as a source of confidence, because the confidence was just there, underneath everything. "Tell me about your rifle," he said. She told him. She told him about the platform, the modifications, the years of practice. She told him about the range sessions she had run on her own time and her own budget, driving out to civilian ranges on weekends because the Army had not offered her a slot in a marksmanship program that would have given her the training she'd needed, so she had built it herself. She told him about the call-outs she had made, usually off the books, usually in situations where someone higher up the chain had already decided she wasn't the right person for the job, and where the person they decided was the right person for the job had encountered a problem she was able to solve. Dex listened. He did not ask many questions. He had the skill, common to very experienced NCOs, of being silent in a way that made it easy to keep talking. When she finished, he said, "How many?" She understood what he meant. In situations like the one on the ridgeline, where someone else was in the assigned position and I was operating outside my designated role. She thought for a moment. 7 times. 6 were recorded in some form, in unit reports, debrief notes, somewhere. 1 was not. 6 times you fired outside your designated role, Dex said, and this is the first investigation. This is the first time someone filed a complaint, she said. Dex was quiet. He picked up his coffee, which had been sitting untouched. He looked at it for a moment, then he set it down. "The previous 6 times, he said. "Outcomes? No friendly casualties in any of those engagements," Nix said. "In 3 of the 6, my assessment is that there would have been at least 1 without the shot I took. In 1 of them," she stopped. "In 1 of them, I'm certain." "Why are you certain?" She looked at him. "Because I was the one watching, and I saw what was coming, and I took the shot that stopped it, and 6 people walked back to the wire that night who would not have otherwise." She paused. "1 of them did not walk back to the wire. He died at Landstuhl 2 weeks later from wounds he received before I engaged." She paused again. "I know his name. I know all their names." Dex was very still. He had the expression of a man who has heard something he recognizes, who is running it against an experience of his own that is close enough to the shape of what he just heard to produce a specific quality of attention. "What was his name?" Dex said. "Corporal Marcus Teal," she said. 25th Infantry Division. Married. 1 daughter. He was from Savannah. Dex nodded slowly. He did not say anything for a moment. He just nodded, the way people nod when they're acknowledging weight. "And nobody knows that you were in that position," he said. "The unit knows someone took those shots," Nix said. "The attribution was listed as unknown in the official report. I was listed in the report as present in a medical support capacity." Dex looked at her for a long time. "You didn't correct the record." "I was asked not to," she said, "by someone above me, in writing, which I still have." The expression on Dex's face shifted. It was a small shift, but she had learned to read small things, and she read this one clearly. He had just decided something. "I'm going to make some calls," he said. "They'll know you're making calls," she said. "Yes," Dex said. "That's the point." The review concluded 12 days later. Nix was not present when the final determination was made. She heard about it the same way she heard about most things on the firebase through Prenn, who had been in the building for a different meeting and had stayed in the hallway long enough to hear the outcome. No violation. The shot on the ridgeline had been reclassified as a defensive action taken within the scope of her training and her role as a combat medical element operating in a hostile environment. The CID investigator had filed the paperwork. Tate had signed it. According to Prenn, Tate had not spoken during the proceeding except to answer 2 direct questions, and both answers had been less than a sentence. What Prenn did not know, what Nix had not told him, was that 3 days before the review concluded, she had received a call from a number she didn't recognize. The voice was female, senior, the kind of senior that does not announce itself because it does not need to. The voice said, "Sergeant First Class Nix, I'm going to ask you a question, and I'd like a direct answer." "Yes, ma'am." "The action in March 2021, Kunar Province. Fa B. Terran, the unknown shooter in the official report." Nix said nothing, which was also an answer. "You were trained through which program?" the voice said. "I was not trained through a program," Nix said. "I trained myself." A pause. Then, "I see." Another pause, longer. "I'd like to meet with you," the voice said, "when your current situation is resolved, not before." And then, before Nix could respond, "The Army has missed you, Sergeant. That's going to stop." The call ended. Nix held the phone and sat in the quiet of the clinic for a while after that. Then she stood up, put on her stethoscope, and walked to the ward. because the two soldiers she had recovering from dehydration needed to be checked, and the supply requisition for the next week's medications needed to go in by 1800, and the work did not wait because other things were happening. It never had. That was how she had always operated. Both jobs simultaneously, neither one allowed to slip because the other one was difficult. She was good at both. She had always been good at both. It was only now, 7 years into the quieter of the two careers, that someone had noticed. The meeting happened 6 weeks later, at a conference room in a building at Fort Campbell that had no unit designation on the door. Brigadier General Amara Solis Page was already seated when Nix arrived, which meant she had been watching the door, which meant she had wanted to see how Nix entered a room she hadn't been in before. Nix entered it the way she entered everything, without checking whether she was welcome. Solis Page was 57. She had the specific compactness of a person who has spent decades moving through spaces that were not designed for her, who has learned to take up exactly as much room as she needs, and no more, because every inch beyond that is a negotiation she doesn't have time for. She had commanded a combat support hospital in Iraq in 2006, had served 2 additional deployments in advisory roles that were described in public documents in language vague enough to tell you they were the important kind, and had in the last 3 years been quietly building something inside the Army's medical command structure that the people inside it called a program and the people outside it called something that didn't have a name yet. She looked at Nix the way Nix looked at a patient, with complete methodical attention, running through a checklist that was invisible but thorough. "Sit down," she said. Nix sat. "Command Sergeant Major Dex told me you trained yourself," Solis Page said. "Not a program, not a course, yourself." "Yes, ma'am." "Starting when?" "I was 23, Nix said. "I was assigned to a unit that needed someone with long-range capability. There was no slot for me to train through official channels, so I found the resources I could find and I built it. On your own time?" "Yes, ma'am." "With your own equipment?" "Yes, ma'am." Solis Page was quiet for a moment. She did not look down at her folder. She kept her eyes on Nix. 7 times in field conditions, she said. 6 officially documented in some form, 1 not. Nix said nothing. "Tell me about the one that wasn't documented," Solis Page said. This was the thing Nix had not said out loud to anyone except Dex. She had carried it the way she carried the names, not as a burden exactly, but as a weight she had accepted, because she believed she was supposed to be the person capable of carrying it. She told Solis Page about Taryn, about the patrol that had gone out on bad route intelligence, about the position she had set up early before anyone else, because setting up early was how she worked, because position was decided by whoever got there first and took it, and she was always the one who got there first, about the 30 seconds she'd had, about the 2 shots that had connected and the 2 that hadn't, and what the 2 that hadn't had cost. She said the names, not just Teals, all 4 of the men who had been on the vehicle when the remaining threat reached the road. She said each name completely, with the same weight she would have given a diagnosis, because they deserved that. Because names spoken fully, with full weight, were a form of accuracy. And accuracy was the one standard she had never lowered. Solis Page listened. She had a stillness to her that was not coldness. It was the stillness of someone who has received serious information many times and has learned to hold it without being knocked sideways by it. When Nix finished, Solis Page said, "Their families were told it was an ID, yes, ma'am." Nix's voice was steady. "I found out 6 months later, and you carried that." "I carry it," Nix said. Present tense. Solis Page nodded once. She opened the folder in front of her. She turned it and slid it across the table. Nix looked at it. She did not open it immediately. She looked at the outside of it. "That is a proposal," Solis Page said, "for an advanced combat medicine and tactical marksmanship integration program operated under Army Medical Command. Small cohorts, 12-week cycle, curriculum built around the reality that the medic in the field is frequently the only person in position to take a shot, and we currently give them no training for that eventuality, and then we file investigations when they take it anyway." She paused. "I want someone to design and run it." Nix looked up from the folder. "The families," she said. Solis Page looked at her steadily. She knew immediately what that meant. "If this goes forward the way I intend it to go forward," Solis Page said, "those 4 names come with it. There will be a full accounting of what happened at Taryn. Their families get the truth, not the version they have." She paused. "That is not a favor I am offering you. That is a correction the Army owes them that has been owed for too long already." Nix set her hand flat on top of the closed folder. She looked at it. She thought about the night she had written 4 names in her medical log. In the section she kept at the back, the personal section, the one she used to record the things she needed to carry but not forget. She had not written anything beneath the names because she hadn't known what to write. There was no word adequate to what had happened or to what the people whose names those were had deserved. "I'll need to review the full curriculum structure," she said. "Take it with you," Solis Page said. "And I'll need the program to be operationally independent from installation command," Nix said. "Not because I'm difficult." She paused. "Because the people who put medics in tactical positions and then investigate them when they perform tactically are the same people who would design a program that doesn't actually change anything." Solis Page looked at her for a long moment. Something in her expression moved. A small thing, a brief thing, the expression of a person who has heard a precise statement that matches exactly the conclusion they had already reached on their own. "Done," she said. Outside the building, the afternoon had turned cold. Nix stood on the steps for a moment with the folder under her arm and the wind moving across the parking lot with the flat insistence of a Kentucky autumn. Prenn was leaning against the side of a vehicle 30 meters away. He was not in uniform. He had driven 4 hours to be here, which was not something she had asked him to do, and which she understood the full significance of. "Well?" he said. She walked toward him. "I'm building something," she said. He nodded. "About time," he said, not as a compliment, as a fact. The same way she stated facts, directly, without softening, because softening facts was a courtesy that did not serve anybody. She looked out across the parking lot, across the tree line at the edge of the post, where the gray sky was sitting low on the hills, and the light was the particular quality of late afternoon in the fall, real and cold and completely indifferent to whatever any of them decided to do beneath it. She thought about the folder under her arm and the names she would put on the dedication page, because she had already decided there would be a dedication page, and she had already decided what it would say, and it would say their names fully, the way she said everything, with complete weight, nothing abbreviated, nothing approximated. Marcus Teal, Devlin Cross, Pham Quang, Rogelio Ibarra. She had never written anything beneath those names in her log. She was about to.